Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Joey Osborne Show. I'm your host, Joey Osborne, and draft season is finally upon us, and with it, the first mock draft of 2026. So let's get into it here, obviously, with the first overall pick. The Las Vegas Raiders, obviously, making a lot of changes in scheduling Geno Smith and are trading Max Crosby on Friday for 2 first-round picks. They are looking for their franchise guy, and I think they're going to draft it here with probably the best and only, in my opinion, adequate NFL quarterback in this draft, in Fernando Mendoza from Indiana, obviously leading Indiana to the national championship this year. In what was a spectacular season for Indiana, has a lot of great play. He can make those big time throws, and he can scramble as well. So I think for the Raiders, obviously, while I don't think Mendoza is going to be a superstar day one for the Raiders, they need a quarterback, and you get a pretty good one here in Mendoza. Moving on here to the next pick, we got the New York Jets, another team that, had a pretty pitiful year. First-year head coach Aaron Glenn did not do a good job. Justin Fields was terrible, and obviously is now released. So they're looking for a quarterback. However, this year, there's not really any quarterbacks, but since Dante Moore, I kind of saw he was going to the Jets and said no and went back to college. So now this puts the Jets in an interesting spot, and I think for the Jets, there's a lot of great options. I think Arvell Reese, the linebacker out of Ohio State, is a freak pretty much on any single physical metric. He's crazy quick and a great linebacker. I think they can go edge of David Bailey or Ruben Bain. I think definitely a lot on the defense they can do. And offensively, if they want to, they could as well. However, I personally think there's some really good defensive players, and I think the Jets, especially after training Quinn Williams and Sauce Gardner, they need some talent on that defense, and I think defensive line in particular. So I think the Jets here at number 2 are going to take Ruben Bain Jr., the edge rusher out of Miami, who looks spectacular this year, with their second overall pick here. Now moving on to the Arizona Cardinals, another team with a lot of changes, obviously a new head coach, and with it, a new quarterback most likely coming in. Obviously, we don't know who that is yet, but with the release of Kyle Murray, they are looking to rebuild and build around some great talent, which they have gone in the draft in the last couple of years. Obviously, with Paris Johnson, Marvin Harrison Jr., and Walter Nolan have all looked quite good. They're looking to continue to build, and I think they need a quarterback. Obviously, I think that's going to be more of a free agency move, and they're still rebuilding team this year. But I think they're going to look at areas where they can truly improve, and I think a lot of great spots they want to improve. But I think the biggest one, honestly, for them is the offensive line. Obviously, Johnson does a great job, but they need no offensive tackle, and there's a spectacular one in Francis Mauigoa out of Miami, another Miami guy going in the top 3. Spectacular this year. In their quest, obviously, to go to the national championship, played very well. He's a great pass protector, and I think Arizona, because they obviously had offensive coach, they're looking to build around the offense. I think getting an offensive lineman is a good selection here for him in this spot. Moving on here to the Tennessee Titans, obviously not a good season for them. Cam Ward had a lot of issues, definitely struggling. However, showed a lot of promise, and yet, and honestly, a lot of the struggles look to be more his teammates than anything. So I think, obviously Tennessee, they have a big weakness of not having enough weapons. They need to get more offensive weapons for Cam Ward. And there's a real spectacle on which allegedly they have been really taken in by, and that is Jeremiah Love, the running back out of Notre Dame. And I think that's where the Titans scout. Even though they could go defense, I think they really love Jeremiah Love's game. He is obviously the best running back in this draft. I think one of the best ones we have seen in a long time, and I think this is a guy who can be playing for a lot of years. And I think for Titans, they are looking for superstar players, especially on the offensive side of the ball. And I think he's one of the best players available in this spot, and I think it's a great pick for them. Looking at what they got. Obviously now, we move on to the New York Giants, and they probably have to be one of the most exciting bad teams ever, with Jackson Dart playing spectacular his rookie season, obviously looking to build on that and continue. Obviously Cam Scadaboo and Malik Nabers come back too, and with the hiring of John Harbaugh, this would be a vastly improved team, I believe, from last year to this year. There's a lot of excitement, and I think with that, the Giants, they have a lot of great young talent. They continue to look to get more. And I think at this number 5 spot, there's a lot of options they can do. I think offensively, they're pretty well set. You could obviously draft another offensive lineman maybe. But I think mainly we're looking on the defense if you're the Giants. And there was specifically in the secondary, I think the pass rush was great. The linebackers were good. but that secondary was definitely not the best. And I think, if you have the option to get a pretty spectacular safety or cornerback, you do it. And there's a heck of a one in Caleb Downs, the safety out of Ohio State. And that's who I think the Giants are going to take at 6 to help reinforce that young defense and hopefully lead them to starting to become contenders in the league. And moving on here to the Cleveland Browns, obviously, there's a lot of holes. I think they could really address nearly every single spot. I think there's not really a spot open. They'd be like, oh, you don't need to address that. I think no matter what, whatever the best player available is there, you take. Obviously, their offense needs a lot of work. But, as well, the defense, I think, obviously losing Jim Schwartz here, that's going to change a lot of things. But, obviously, JOK, most likely never going to play again. And while Swessinger was really good this year, obviously, Defensive Rookie of the Year, I think they're looking for maybe even more from that defense. And I think the idea of pairing Swessinger with an elite linebacker is something that the Browns can look at. And I think they should decide to do it, because obviously they're going to win games by the defense. If they're going to win, it'll be by the defense, not the offense. And in this spot, I just don't really see, other than Cornell Tate, I think that's really your best option for the Browns. And I think there's a spectacular linebacker here in Arvell Reese. And I think the Browns, they decided to go for the best player available in this spot. And they're going to take Arvell Reese, the linebacker out of Ohio State, with that selection. Moving on here to the Washington Commanders. Once again, a very disappointing team. Obviously, Jane Daniels' injuries this year played a big role in this. And obviously, they'd have to trade off some pieces. They made some changes, and they're looking to be a better team next year. And I think one area where they've always struggled, because honestly, last year, they kind of came out and know they weren't supposed to be good, and they really weren't a team that was that ready. They was just elevated by the player Jane Daniels. And I think in that spot specifically, with the defense, they need help there. This is a great defensive draft, and I think they're going to get a spectacular player here as they draft David Bailey, the edge rusher out of Texas Tech, with that selection as they try to fortify that defense and hopefully get themselves a pass rusher who can do some real damage like I think Bailey can in the NFL. Moving on here now to the New Orleans Saints. Obviously, this is a year I think everyone thought they would be in last place by the fourth overall pick. But they really showed a lot of great fight at the end of the year. Tyler Show, someone that I think everyone overlooked, including myself, has turned out to be a pretty good quarterback. Obviously, we'll see how he plays in year 2. But he played greatly whenever he was starting toward the end of the year. And I think the Saints really hit their stride at the end of the year, especially with Kellen Moore. I think he's done a good job. And I think while the Saints are at 8, they can definitely get more. And I think they need to definitely work on what they have. But I think there's a great player here they could look to. Obviously, you already have Chris Olave, but Show looks to be like he could be some, and I think they want to build on Show. And I think honestly on offense, if you can get a great offensive player, when you have a good young quarterback, if you can get a good wide receiver to help him out, you do. And I think Cornell Tate, the wide receiver out of Ohio State, is gonna go here at 8 to the Saints as they pair up two former Ohio State wide receivers together with Olave and Tate, and I think that'd be a great pairing, especially for a young quarterback Show. If you can get two guys open that he can pass to, it's going to be great for him. Moving on here to the Kansas City Chiefs, who are in a spot where I think no one thought they would be. Obviously, this is going to be a rebuild year. Mahomes is out to most likely November. Kelsey's in the air. There's a lot of areas they need help with. I think wide receiver is a big one. But specifically, this offense in general, that is where they've struggled. I think offensive line, they need some reinforcements there. And I think Spencer Fanu, the offensive tackle out of Utah, is their selection. Obviously, again, we have Juwan Taylor, thankfully, They should hopefully be in a better spot, and I think this helps them in that regard. Get the offensive at least a little better to the point, obviously, next year. Without Mahomes, they're not going to be able to do much. But I think the offensive line has become a big weakness. I think that's a lot of reasons why Mahomes struggled. They got Fanu here at 10 to help, obviously, protect Mahomes better whenever he comes back. Moving on here to the Bengals here at 10. Obviously, another team had a lot of big issues this year, looking to get back to where they need to be. And I think the biggest issue for them is their defense. The offense is great, but the defense really struggles. Trey Hendrickson obviously now leaving the team. Shamar Stewart was not a good pick. He has been a struggle so far, to say the least, and they need a pass rusher more than anything, because every single team in the AFC North now has at least one elite pass rusher. Obviously, Miles Garrett with the Browns, Watt with the Steelers, and now Max Crosby with the Ravens. So if you're Joe Burrow, you're a little concerned that, and I think for the Bengals, they need to get a defensive talent here in this spot. But by this point, obviously, most pass rush is gone. I think Falk's a pretty big reach here, so I would not go Falk. But I think they could use definitely anything on defense, and I think Sonny Styles, the linebacker out of Ohio State's a good fit, especially since they traded Logan Wilson. They need another linebacker, and I think he can help out with the defense in that regard and hopefully make them at least somewhat better. But, for the Bengals truly to be able to get a spectacular player like that for the edge rush, they're going to have to trade up, and I just don't know if they have the assets to trade up at this moment. But moving on here to the Miami Dolphins, obviously a new team with a lot of new pieces. They're gonna have a new quarterback. They're looking in different spots. But I think the main thing they should be looking at, and I think what they need to be looking at, is on the defense at the moment. I think offensively, you're not gonna get that great of a quarterback, and there's nothing really here to draft, in my opinion. So I think, obviously looking at that, I would say, because I don't think they really need wide receiver as much as people would think. I think defensively, they have a lot of holes, and I think the secondary is a big one. And there's a great one here on Mansour Delane, the cornerback out of LSU. And that's who I think the Dolphins can take with their selection here in this spot. Moving on here to the Cowboys. This is an interesting one because there's a lot of places they can go. Obviously, they did play better last year. George Pickens coming into the offense helped in that regard. So I don't think offensively they need anything. Defensively, obviously, they lost Micah Parsons. That's not what they wanted to see. They're looking for improvement on that defense specifically. So I think in this spot here, wow, I think anything defensively is a reach. I think that makes the Cowboys willing to trade down here in this spot. And I think this is going to be the first trade of this mock draft. And I think Dallas is going to make a certain trade with a team who is looking to make a splash after another year of mediocrity, and obviously this year now seeing a lot of changes, a new head coach, potentially a new quarterback, we'll see on that, and some other areas where there could be significant change, but also a team that wants to make some noise for their hometown team, and that's the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously, they have 12 picks in this draft. They have 3 third-round picks. They're not keeping all these picks. They have 2 fourths. They are going to probably most likely trade up, in my opinion, because they're not taking anyone. They're not taking all these players with these picks. And I think they're going to trade 21, 37, and 90, 76, and third round 99 to the Dallas Cowboys. And with that selection, they're going to take care of their biggest need, which clearly they have, and that's wide receiver. And I think Mekhi Lemon, the wide receiver out of USC, is the Steelers selection as they trade up to 12 with the Cowboys in this mock draft. Now moving on here to the LA Rams, I think a lot of places they could go. I think potentially they could go quarterback. I think Matt Stafford is probably going to be the last year. And I think they can get a project guy here if they like. I think, while I don't personally like Ty Simpson, I think there was a lot of movement in that area toward him, specifically in the Rams locker room. And I think with this selection, the Rams are going to shock everyone, and I think they're going to take Ty Simpson, the quarterback out of Alabama, with that selection. I think for Ty Simpson, he's a guy that has to sit for at least a year. The Rams are not even willing to do that. I think that's what they desire as they get, obviously, Stafford's last year. They look to get better. And I think they decide to, to look more to the future than the present with this selection. Moving on here to the Raiders, once again, they have another first-round pick, and once again, there's a lot of things you can do. Obviously, the Raiders, you just drafted Mendoza, and there's a lot of areas you could go. But I think, obviously, Jordan Tyson would be a good selection here. I think wide receiver-wise, they do need something. But however, I think, obviously, when it comes to Mendoza, the Raiders do have a bigger issue, and that issue is the offensive line. It was an atrocious offensive line last year. Really, Colin Miller was really the only good one on that unit. I think Powers Johnson did decent, but he's playing out of position. So clearly he needs to go back to center. But I think, obviously, with Mendoza, he is going to be the crown jewel for the Raiders, and they need to make sure to protect him. And I think with Monroe Freeling, the offensive tackle out of Georgia right here, is a good selection to ensure that Mendoza is protected and kept safely. Because obviously they are looking to protect Mendoza and make sure he can succeed. And if they can get Mendoza time, he can make those plays. And I think building on the offensive line will be the second main priority for the Raiders in this draft. Moving on here to Tampa Bay Buccaneers, obviously a disappointing year. They're looking to have some better luck next year. Obviously, a lot of injuries, and things just didn't play out the way they wanted. And I think when you're the Buccaneers, you were looking for a lot better improvement in that regard. And I think there's a lot of areas that the Buccaneers could really add on to. I think offensive line, you can make the case for. I think you can make the case for defense. I think even to regard, you can make a case for no wide receiver because, Mike Evans is most likely leaving in this regard. And I think right here, that is somewhere they do look at. I think edge rusher is the other big one. And I think Keldrick Falk, the edge rusher out of Auburn, is their selection there. So they hope to fix that defensive line as well. Obviously, the interior is doing fine. It's just the edge rushers they have had some trouble within this last year. And moving on here to the Jets once again. Obviously, they just took Bain at 2. They're looking once again, just honestly, in my opinion, a few of them, just going to get the best player available. I think the one area where they really lost was, I think, cornerback, Jamard McCoy, I think is definitely a good option there in this point for the Jets. But I think there's a great defensive player, and I think the D-line, they got to build on more. Obviously, losing Quinn Williams, a defensive tackle. They need another defensive tackle, and I think Peter Woods, the defensive tackle out of Clemson, is going to be their selection now as they continue to build that defense. I think specifically in the defensive line, getting both Bain and Woods, I think, would be a great haul for the Jets, and it would be definitely a very formidable defensive line for next season. Especially if Aaron Glenn, as a defensive-minded head coach, if you can build strong defense, that puts him in probably the best position he can be in my thinking. Moving on here to the Lions, obviously no disappointed injury-riddled deal for them. Had a lot of high hopes. They are looking to improve. I think offensive line, they have lost a lot of guys. That's an area where they got to look. I think definitely on defense, they need some extra help, specifically in the edge rush. I think there's a lot of places they can look. And I think in this spot here, I think edge rusher is a good one, and I think offensive line is a good one. But I think right here, Akeem Mesidor, the edge rusher out of Miami, is going to be the selection in that spot to get Aiden Hudson an edge rushing mate and hopefully help him out as they try to be more effective on defense. Moving on here to the Minnesota Vikings. Obviously, this is another team. They're in a weird spot. Obviously, J.J. McCarthy was not very good. They're quarterback needy. I think they addressed that in free agency. I don't see that in the draft, obviously. Now, both Mendoza and Simpson are gone, so I don't think they can really draft anything to begin with in the first round. But I think this is an area where they could be looking and, try to figure out what to do there. I think offensive line's no spot you can look at, but I think also cornerback here. And I think Jamon McCoy, the cornerback out of Tennessee, is a good selection here as they hope to build up a little more in that secondary, which was, I think, definitely not a strength for them last season. And I think really in this spot, there's just not much they can do on the offensive side in this spot because they don't need wide receiver, and that's really what's here at the moment. So I think defense is where they go in this spot here. Moving on to 19 with the Panthers. Obviously, they had a breakout year. Liked a lot of what they did. Obviously, we're looking to see what more they can do. And I think there's a lot of spots really that they could go. But I think in this one, they don't really need wide receiver as much as people think. I think offensive line really is where they need to make sure they can protect Bryce Young. And I think right here with Olivega Iona, the interior offensive lineman out of Penn State, is a good selection there to protect Bryce Young, who is budding into a star in the NFL at this point. Moving on here now to Dallas. They're going to have back-to-back picks here as they have both 20 from the Packers and 21 from the trade-up in this mock draft to the Steelers. And I think they make some noise with both selections here on the defensive side of things. I think with this pick, I think they just take the best defensive player available. And I think in that regard, that is going to be Caleb Banks, defensive tackle out of Florida, in this spot. And I think right here, 21 as well. they're gonna go defense again, and I think this time they're willing to reach a little bit here. And I think Cassius Howe, the edge rusher out of Texas A&M, is their selection at 21, which was traded to the Steelers. Obviously, they helped rebuild that defensive line, which was a big struggle, especially without Micah Parsons last year. Obviously, Aaron Quinn Williams is helping in that regard, but they clearly need more, and there's two young guys who can help make that a more effective pass rush for this next season. Like that is clearly, in my opinion, the Cowboys' biggest reason why they probably went up playoff contenders this year. Is they just did not have a good defense, and they just could not get the quarterback from Micah Parsons. Moving on here to the Chargers. Obviously, a disappointing season. They had a lot of great success, and then just really kind of fell off there with injuries, especially on the offensive line here. And I think in this spot here, the main thing they need is offensive line. They need offensive linemen. And I think in this spot here, I think Caden Proctor, the offensive tackle out of Alabama, is taken with this selection as they try to beef up that offensive line and protect Justin Herbert, because clearly not protecting Herbert is what's causing a lot of the problems here. Now moving on here to the Philadelphia Eagles, they are definitely a disappointment this year. They're looking for some new players in key spots here, specifically because things have not worked out well for them this last year. And potentially with A.J. Brown leaving, I think wide receiver is an area they look at. I think definitely they need it, but I also don't exactly think A.J. Brown is getting traded this offseason. It just depends on what they get. But I think they have a bigger issue on offense, and I think that is Dallas Goedert. He is a free agent from my understanding, and most likely he is not coming back. And he was a big part of that offense last year, and I think they need tight end more than ever. And I think there was a spectacular tight end here in Kenyon Sadiq out of Oregon. He has looked spectacular. He has like TK Metcalf measurings. I think this can be a really good tight end, and I think for the Eagles, while Tyson is there, I think Sadiq is a better option now as they get a new tight end to help Jalen Hurts in that spot offensively. Moving on here to the Browns again, obviously, they took the linebacker Orville Reese with their first round pick. In this spot here, I think they're going to look at to offense this time, and I think Jordan Tyson, the wide receiver out of Arizona State, he is seeing a sharp decline in the stock, but Cleveland really needs wide receivers, especially for Shedeur. And I think in this regard, you get that wide receiver here in a spectacular one, in my opinion, in Jordan Tyson. And he gets to reunite with his brother, who plays for the Cleveland Cavs as well. So that's a kind of funny family reunion there as well. Moving on here to the Bears. They were spectacular last year, showing a lot of improvement. I think definitely the way the Bears organization looks at this season, they are looking to continue to build off of what they did this year. I think Caleb Williams looked phenomenal, and they are looking to improve, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And with this, there's a lot of spots they can go, but I think defensive line is the best spot. I think Caden McDonald out of Ohio State, Warriors Reach, is their selection now to help build up that defensive line. Moving on here to the Buffalo Bills. Their main issue is wide receiver. They obviously just traded for DJ Moore, giving up a second-round pick. But I don't think you stop there with DJ Moore. You need to get another wide receiver here. And I think the options where they're at are going to be kind of tough, because obviously trading that second-round pick, I don't think they're really able to trade up if they want to. I think they're stuck at this spot here at 26. So they need to make a decision at wide receiver. And looking at that, you have Denzel Boston and Kevin Concepcion and Omar Cooper Jr. I think out of these three options, I do think Denzel Boston's the best one, and I think that's who they take here with that selection. Moving on here to the San Francisco 49ers. Obviously a disappointing year. Looking to be better. Obviously getting bumped to the divisional was not what they were looking for. And I think in this spot here, they need some really, and also some spots. But I think in this regard, obviously they are going to most likely be losing Ayuk here. I think they need a wide receiver, and I think Kevin Concepcion is a good selection at that point here for the 49ers, especially if you're losing Ayuk. Porcel's looked great, but I believe Jennings is a free agent, so they need a wide receiver, and you can get one now in this spot. Moving on here to the Houston Texans. They're in a weird spot. Obviously, the defense is probably the best in the NFL by far. It's a crazy defense. However, the offense, especially if CJ Stroud, has really struggled to this point. And I think a lot of the issues have really come from horrid offensive line play. I think it's stunted Stroud's growth here. And I think for them, they need to get an offensive lineman. They really do. And I think Caleb Lamu, he's the best option there from Utah. And I think that's who the Texans take as they try to protect Stroud. Moving on here now to the Chiefs once again. Obviously, they have another first-round pick thanks to the Rams for the McDuffie trade. And this spot here, obviously, they took offensive line with their first-round pick. And the first-round pick, I think in this spot, once again, they look to the offense. And I think Omar Cooper Jr., he is someone that's shooting up draft boards. And I think he just sneaks into the first round here as he's selected by the Chiefs at 29 via that pick from the Rams. Moving on here to the Broncos. Obviously, spectacular year. They're happy where things are. But, they have areas where they need to improve. And I think definitely the one is, the defense is great. But I think as well they could be looking in this spot to continue to improve that. I think there's areas where they could. Running back's another one, but I believe running back most likely is probably going to be taken in free agency. But I think defensively they could. I think linebacker was one area where they could look to improve. And I think they do here with C.J. Allen, the linebacker out of Georgia, with that selection here. Moving on here to the New England Patriots, obviously losing the Super Bowl. They are looking for some help. I think definitely they had some big issues, especially on the offensive line at the end of that season there. And I think they look to improve there. But I think also defensively, the pass rush, they could improve that. And I think in this spot here, I think T.J. Parker, the edge rusher out of Clemson, is a good selection here for them as they try to hopefully get a little more of that pass rush this year and get back to the Super Bowl. Moving on here to the Seattle Seahawks, all the Super Bowl champions. They're in a great spot, but they're potentially losing more pieces. I think Tariq Woolen is most likely gone. Kenneth Walker is most likely gone. So I think in this selection, they look in different spots. I think one area in which they'd look is running back. But I don't think they do that in the first round. There's just not much in the first one other than, Love. But Love's going to be gone, top 5 pick. But I think definitely cornerbacks one area to look at. Safety's another one. But I think really in this spot, what they're going to do is, I do think cornerback, and I think Avian Terrell out of Clemson is a good selection here for the Seahawks as they continue to build another spectacular defense in Seattle and hopefully repeat as Super Bowl champions. Moving on here to the Jets. Obviously, the first round pick in the second round pick. A lot of areas they can go here. I think this really depends on what they want. This really depends. I think defense. I think they can go here again. Obviously, they did 2-1s on the defensive line. I think right here, I can go for the secondary. I think Dylan Theinman out of Oregon is their selection. He's a great safety. They're looking for some help definitely in the secondary after Sauce Gardner's left. I think that helps in that regard for them. Moving on here to the Cardinals. Obviously, they did address the offense with their first round selection. I think this time they do give attention to the defense, and I think Zion Young, the edge rusher out of Missouri, is that selection there. Moving on here to the Titans. Obviously got Love with their first round pick. Now we'll see what they do with the second, and I believe in this regard, I think this time they will at least look at, offense again, in my opinion. I think maybe interior offensive line is an interesting spot, and I think they're going to reach a little bit here, but I think Emmanuel Pagnon out of Oregon is going to be the selection at that spot to protect Cam Ward. Moving on here to the Raiders. Once again, went Mendoza, and then they went offensive line. I think in this spot again, I think they're going to go offensive line again, or potentially wide receiver. Looking at what's there, Brazel is there, Chris Bell. So there's some interesting names there, and I think those are the names they look at. But I also think they understand that offensive line was one of their big issues, and I think they're willing to take another offensive lineman with this pick. I think Blake Miller out of Clemson is selection there as they continue to beef up an offensive line to protect Fernando Mendoza. Moving on here to the Giants. Once again, a lot of places they can go. I think definitely defensively, they got a great player for the secondary. I think this time they look to protect their big star in Jackson Dart, and I think Max Ianchenoa, the offensive tackle out of Arizona State, is their selection as they try to hopefully improve their offensive line and help Jackson Dart out. And also Cam Scaboo as well, getting through the gaps. Moving on here to Houston. They need offensive line, but offensive line really, it is there, and I do think they look at it. I think definitely Lee Hunnell is another one to look at on the defensive line. Continue to build up that defense, but I think at the end of the day here, I think Chase Bisontis, the interior offensive lineman out of Texas A&M's, the best selection because offensive line is their biggest issue. And I think that helps them out, especially if CJ Stroud, if they can get him more time to throw the ball, hopefully that helps with his decision making. We'll see. But I think definitely offensive line play is one of the core reasons why they have truly struggled in this regard at this spot. Moving on here to the Browns. I think once again, obviously, they did one on defense, did one on offense. I say this time, I think they're going to go back onto the defense. Their secondary is pretty good. I think definitely they do view that as an area, however, they still could improve at. Linebacker, obviously, this draft, they don't need any more in that spot, but I think it's an area well they can continue to look at in this regard. And I think right here, obviously potentially Denzel Ward may get released. It's still up in the air if that's happening. But I think secondary, I think safety as well, they could use work. And I think Emmanuel McNeil-Warren out of Toledo, the safety, I think he's a good selection there for the Browns as they continue to build a young defense that can hopefully win them games in this regard here. Moving on here to the Chiefs. Obviously, they just traded McDuffie. I think secondary is an area they can look up. They've looked at offense mostly in this one so far. I think this time, they're going to go with a cornerback, and I think Colin Hood, he dropped a little bit here. I don't think, my next mock draft, he'll drop this far, and I don't think in the real draft he will. But I think there's a lot of teams that are selecting over need over quantity at this point in the draft, and I think the Chiefs, they find both quantity and need in this regard of Hood, and they select him here in this spot. Moving on here to the Bengals, once again, their defense is atrocious. They need defense. And I think especially pass rush, they need that on the defensive line. I really like Lee Hunnell out of Texas Tech, and I think that's the selection here as they continue to build a young defensive line, and hopefully Samar Stewart can show some semblance of being an actual NFL pass rusher. Because at this point, he really has not, and that's a big issue. Moving on here to the New Orleans Saints, obviously addressed wide receiver in the first round. A lot of areas they can go. I think cornerback is one. They are losing some guys in that regard. Running back is another, obviously. They definitely starting to have some struggles with Kamara getting up there in age. But I think, they're losing one of their top cornerbacks in free agency. So I think they need to address that. And I think Brandon Siss, the cornerback out of South Carolina, is where they address that in this regard. Moving on to the Dolphins. Once again, a lot of players they can get here. But I think they are losing Tyreek Hill. They probably do need a wide receiver too. And while I didn't think in the first round it was the best move to get a wide receiver, I do think in the second round, however, it is a good idea to get a wide receiver. And I think Chris Barzell is a really good wide receiver. Has a lot of great intangibles. And I think for the Dolphins, they're looking for a guy they can develop. I think that's a guy you can develop into a pretty solid wide receiver here in Barzell with that selection. Moving on here to the Jets once again. They just need to work on that defense. I think offensively there's not much to do. They could do some. But I think defensively they need to work on it. And I think Anthony Hill Jr. out of Texas is a good selection here for the Jets in that spot. Moving on here to the Ravens, obviously. Trading that first round pick, so this is their first pick of this draft. A lot of areas they can look at. I think definitely there's a lot of ones. But I think wide receiver is the biggest here. And I think Chris Bell is a good option. I think Zachariah Brants is another good option. And I think in this spot here, I think Zachariah Brants is going to be the one that goes in that spot to the Ravens as they continue to hopefully find that wide receiver one they have been looking for Lamar Jackson. Moving on here to the Buccaneers. Once again, a lot of places they can go. Obviously, one edge rusher this time. In the first round, I think in this spot, they could be looking at linebacker. That is one area they could be looking at. I think another one could be cornerback. It just depends on what they decide to do. It's also they already addressed defensive line, so it's a weird spot for them. I think there's a lot of areas they could go. However, I do honestly think they may continue to help out with the edge rush because that was a big issue for them. And I think Mason Thomas out of Oklahoma is the selection there in that spot. Moving on here to the Colts. Obviously, traded the first round pick. Things did not go as planned for them. So they're looking to have improvement. Obviously, had a great start of the year, then got injured and had significant issues at the end. they're looking for something here, and I think definitely a lot of areas they could be looking at. But I think Edge Russell is one they definitely could look at, and I think they're going to reach here with Gabe Jacobs out of Illinois with that pick. Moving on here to the Falcons, their first pick. They have areas in need, I think, definitely on defense. They need to continue to improve. I like Chris Johnson here on this spot, the cornerback out of San Diego State. Another guy I think probably shouldn't have fallen this far, but I think you want to go quantity over quality. I think they're trying to go what they need over what the quality is. I think Chris Johnson falls here to the Falcons, and they get him with this pick here. Moving on here to the Vikings. Once again, a lot of places they could go. I don't think there's really any quarterbacks you would be going after in this spot, so I don't think they do that. Running backs, an area where they could be looking, and I think, obviously, getting rid of Aaron Jones, they do need a running back. I think Jadarian Price out of Notre Dame is going to be the selection now, as they get another explosive running back to help out on that offense. Moving on here to the Lions. Once again, they really need defense, and I think cornerbacks an area of big concern. And I think D'Angelo Ponce, the cornerback out of Indiana, is their selection there as they hope to improve on that defense, specifically in the secondary as well. Moving on here to the Panthers. I think this spot, I think they look for an offensive weapon for Bryce Young. I think there's a pretty good one. Two good options here in Eli Stills and Chris Bell. But I think obviously wide receiver they're pretty set on. They could use Bell, but I think tight end is an area where they could look for improvement. And I think Eli Stills out of Vanderbilt is the selection now in that spot. Now moving on here to the Packers with their first pick of the day. Obviously trading their first round pick for Micah Parsons. A lot of areas they could be looking at. I think offensive line's an issue. I think cornerback's an issue. But I would say out of these ones, I would prioritize offensive line. I think Jennings Dunkel out of Iowa is a good selection there for the Packers in that spot. Now moving on here to the Steelers, obviously they traded up in this mock draft. I got a wide receiver Malachi Lennon. Now looking for definitely the next pick here in the second round. And I think linebacker was an area where they had issues in. I think cornerback is another one they can do, but I think it's really in this spot. If you don't get Ponce doesn't fall to you, I think you get for something else. And I think linebacker, there's a really good linebacker here in Jacob Rodriguez. Obviously the Steelers did hire his linebacker coach from Texas A&M onto their staff. So I think this isn't probably an obvious pick here, as I think Jacob Rodriguez out of Texas Tech is drafted by the Steelers in this spot here. Moving on here now to the Eagles. Once again, a lot of areas they can go. But I think in this spot, I think this is where they consider the wide receiver. And there's a great one here on Chris Bell, and I think they take him in this spot. Moving on here to the Chargers. Once again, a lot of areas they can go. I think offensive line's the biggest one. I think Connor Lew out of Auburn is the selection now in that spot. Moving on here to Jacksonville. Their first pick of the day, I think definitely they can look more places. However, I think cornerback is the right one to look at. And I think Keith Abney II out of ASU is their selection in this spot. Moving on here to the Bears. I think in this spot you could go another wide receiver. Probably with Jaquan Biscuit most likely leaving. You need a safety. And AJ Halsey is a good selection in my opinion to hopefully fill in that safety gap in this spot. Moving on here to the 49ers. Once again, a lot of areas you could be looking at. I think in this one for them really though, I think defensive line is one area they need improvement in. And I think Christian Miller out of Georgia is a good selection for them in this spot. Moving on here once again to Houston. A lot of places they could go. I think wide receiver was one you could definitely talk about. And I think really, it just depends on what they want to do. Offensive line, I don't think really in this spot. Just because there's not much there. So I would say I think maybe linebackers we look at. And I think Jake Goldie maybe a good one in that spot to continue to build up that strong defense. Moving on here to the Bears with their selections. Obviously, just got the safety. I think in this spot you could get an edge rusher. You could get, if you want to, a wide receiver. I don't think they need it. You can get cornerback. You can get an edge rusher. And I think Malachi Lawrence out of UCF is a good selection for them in this regard as they continue to build a defensive line up here in this spot. Moving on here to the Rams. Obviously they don't really need a wide receiver. I don't see that there. Cornerback, you just got Dougie. You just got McDuffie, so I think definitely for them. Cornerback, while it's something they definitely willing to address, I don't think it's their biggest need. But we could see what this really depends on like what currently is there for them. And I think looking through this, I would say most likely in this regard, they probably do go cornerback here, and I think Keontae Scott out of Florida is their selection in that spot. Moving on here to Denver. I think this is a team that needs an all-wide receiver. I do think neither for Bo Nix. Malachi Fields looked great for Notre Dame this year, and I like him in this spot here. Moving on here to New England. This is a team definitely, if they wanted to get a wide receiver, they could. They could get Edge Russell, but I think definitely one thing noticed during the Super Bowl is they need to continue to improve that offensive line. I think Caleb Tiernan out of Northwestern can help in that regard for them in this spot. And moving on here to Seattle, obviously, a lot of holes to fill in this spot. I think this is a spot they could give running back. It just really depends on what they see available. At this spot, from what I see, honestly, I don't really think there's much running back-wise. And I think we'll see Shaheed most likely leaving as well. I think wide receiver was a spot they could look to improve at, because Kappa just wasn't that good this year. He was decent, but, it was really just Jackson Smith and the Jig Button until Shaheed got there. So I think this spot, they could look for that. And I think one play I really do like here, wide receiver-wise, is Elijah Surratt out of Indiana. And I think that's what Seattle takes here with this selection in this spot. And that is going to end our first mock draft of the year. I'd like to thank you guys all for watching this video or listening in. Please comment, like, and subscribe. And tune in for more. Thank you.